Hey everyone, it's Jay. Today's video is about graded membrane potentials. Graded membrane potentials are changes in voltage inside a neuron that determine whether or not the neuron sends a signal to another cell. For this video to make sense, you're going to need to understand how a neuron maintains its resting membrane potential and why ions cross the membrane the way that they do. If you need to review those videos, you can check them out on the master list. Function of the nervous system is communication. Neurons send signals from one place to another so that the target cells have the information they need to behave as they should. Neural signals influence activity of other neurons and control muscle activity. Signal sent by a neuron travels as an electrical impulse called an action potential. A neuron fires an action potential if voltage at the initial segment of an axon reaches a high enough level. The initial segment of the axon is called the axon hillock, and the resting voltage at the axon hillock is about a negative 70 millivolts. The neuron fires an action potential if voltage at the axon hillock reaches about negative 55 millivolts, which is called the threshold voltage. Graded membrane potentials are changes in voltage inside a neuron that influence whether or not voltage at the axon hillock reaches threshold. Graded membrane potentials have two properties. First, graded membrane potentials are different sizes. They can be larger or smaller. Second, graded membrane potentials can make the voltage inside the cell more positive or more negative. Let's start with different sizes. In the drawing, the neurons that signal the dendrites are called presynaptic neurons. Imagine the presynaptic neuron releases a chemical that opens sodium channels. Sodium moves into the neuron, some of it diffuses down to the axon hillock, and the positive charge raises the voltage at the axon hillock. Because voltage gets closer to threshold, it makes it more likely that the neuron will fire an action potential. We call this an excitatory graded potential because it activates the neuron. One neurotransmitter that's often excitatory is called glutamate. Imagine this presynaptic neuron releases only a little bit of glutamate. Only a few ion channels will open, and there'll be a small change in voltage down at the axon hillock. But if the presynaptic neuron releases a lot of glutamate, a lot of ion channels will open, and there'll be a larger change in voltage at the axon hillock. So this graded membrane potential can be large or small depending on the amount of neurotransmitter that's released. The second property of a graded membrane potential is that it can make voltage inside the cell more positive or more negative. Imagine instead of glutamate being released at this synapse, the neurotransmitter released is a chemical abbreviated GABA. GABA can bind to receptors that allow chloride to enter the cell. Negative charge entering a neuron makes the voltage more negative, or what we call hyperpolarized. As voltage at the axon hillock moves further away from threshold, the neuron is less likely to fire an action potential, so we call this an inhibitory graded membrane potential. This inhibitory graded membrane potential can be caused by a negative charge entering the cell, but it could also be caused by a positive charge leaving the cell. If a chemical causes potassium channels to open, potassium leaves the cell, decreasing the voltage and making it less likely that the neuron will fire an action potential. The last two examples showed how chemicals called neurotransmitters cause graded membrane potentials. As we go forward, you're going to see that other things cause graded membrane potentials as well, something like mechanical stretch or even light hitting our eye. To summarize this video, we learned that a neuron fires an action potential if voltage at the axon hillock reaches a threshold of about a negative 55 millivolts. Graded membrane potentials determine whether or not a neuron fires an action potential by controlling voltage at the axon hillock. Graded membrane potentials have two properties. They can be larger or smaller. A bigger graded potential is caused by a greater stimulus, And a graded membrane potential can make the inside of the cell more positive or negative. A graded membrane potential that raises voltage inside the cell is called excitatory because it makes it more likely the neuron will fire an action potential. A graded membrane potential that makes the inside of the cell more negative is called inhibitory because it reduces the likelihood a neuron will fire an action potential.